Annie, at the age of 26, was already an accomplished stenographer. Amidst the constant arguments with her boyfriend, their relationship finally came to an end. 3 years have passed, and while people were still debating the morality of having a child from a one-night stand, Annie's child peacefully entered their 3rd year of life. On that fateful day 3 years ago, Annie, after a busy day's work and a breakup with her boyfriend, found herself at an out-of-town event. Following the event, she was invited for dinner by the organizers. Considering herself adept at handling alcohol, she decided to indulge. Everyone at the dinner table seemed anything but ordinary, each adorned with a societal label. Having navigated through the quirks of life for so long, Annie was unfazed. As the saying goes, either change or adapt, and she chose the latter. After dinner, someone offered to escort her back to the hotel. Grateful at the entrance, she stood upright one moment and, as soon as she entered the elevator, her head began to feel heavy and hazy. Leaning gently against the elevator wall, all she wanted was to get back to her room and have a good night's sleep. In front of her stood a young couple, holding hands and engaged in a hushed conversation. Judging by their excited expressions, they were probably discussing plans for the next day. Annie glanced at them briefly before closing her eyes. She had been young once, she said, emphasizing the word once. Now, her high-intensity job left her with barely a moment to catch her breath, let alone entertain other thoughts. She admitted she was never a woman who sought stability and routine. Her desires were never hidden. The elevator reached the top floor, and only after everyone else had left did Annie realize she forgot to press the button. She chuckled to herself, took a step forward to press it, and in the confined space of the elevator, her head spun even more. On that night, like countless others, the darkness was profound yet filled with an enticing allure. However, the cliched scene of entering the wrong room unfolded unexpectedly in Annie's life. She had always thought such incidents were purely products of fiction, but when the door opened from the inside, she realized that reality indeed inspired dramas. A man in pajamas, a white towel hanging around his neck, reluctantly opened the door. He absent-mindedly wiped his still-dripping hair and asked, "Who's there?" Glancing at Annie, he impatiently added, "You've got the wrong room," and instinctively moved to close the door. "Oh, sorry," Annie pouted and continued navigating the maze-like corridor in search of her room. After a few turns, she found herself back at the same door. Persistent and unaware, she kept using her room card to open the door. For the second time, the door opened from the inside. The man's hair was now dry, and his semi-long bangs looked exceptionally smooth. He scrutinized Annie with a refined gaze, unable to fathom her intentions. Annie, on the other hand, stared back at him, appreciating his good looks. After a prolonged silence, the man inclined his body slightly without uttering a word. Surprisingly, Annie, in perfect sync with him, entered the room as if guided by some unseen force. In the middle of the night, Annie woke up to find a warm hand casually resting on her waist, and behind her was the cozy chest of a stranger. The room was pitch black, with only a distant blue dot blinking continuously. She struggled to turn around and then drifted back to sleep in a daze. At the age of 26, she believed she could take responsibility for her actions. When Annie woke up in the morning, it was almost 10 o'clock, and she found herself alone in bed. Her clothes were neatly folded at the bedside. Staring at the impeccably arranged room, it seemed as if the wild events of the previous night were nothing more than a dream. The man had left without a trace, not a single sign about himself. Annie chuckled and mumbled a word at the corner of her mouth. One night? Wearing the clothes from the night before, she went to the front desk to figure out what had happened. When the staff mentioned her room number, she suddenly realized that she had completely mistaken her room. Her heart sank like cotton soaked in water, heavy, making each step she took feel burdensome. Seated at the hotel dining area, Annie ordered a black coffee and let the faint mist from the blanket of her coffee cup waft towards her nose. On her right was the medicine she had just bought. The muffled and slow chimes in the lobby reminded her of the time to take her medication. As she swallowed the pill with the help of the coffee, Annie found herself recalling the body and touch of that unfamiliar man, which made her feel a hint of shame. In this illogical world, many things defy logic, and strangers can engage in intimate physical actions. Her worst fears had come true. I couldn't have made a mistake, I already took the medication. Even taking medication doesn't guarantee absolute certainty. Should we schedule a surgery immediately? She stared at the doctor's mouth moving awkwardly, no longer perceiving these white-coated individuals as angels for the first time. She nodded reluctantly and sat alone in the hospital corridor, caressing her flat abdomen. She couldn't fathom that a little life had been growing here for over 2 months. Her knowledge about such matters was limited, but she had heard that the longer the time, the higher the risk of a miscarriage. Just when she was in a state of confusion, her phone rang, an urgent transcription task for a cultural heritage project. Without much thought, she agreed and went home to prepare the materials. Quickly leaving the hospital, she didn't know exactly what she was avoiding. Perhaps no woman was immune to the fear of those cold machines. When she mustered the courage to return to the hospital 3 days later, she fled again just as she was about to enter the operating room. Standing at a bustling intersection, she called her mother, crying while saying, "Mom, I'm pregnant, and I want to keep the baby." The street echoed with the sounds of wheels on the road and the lively chatter of people. Her mother, for the first time, sternly and resolutely said, "Annie, you must terminate this pregnancy." "Mom, I'm scared." "It's better to be scared now than regret later. You're oversimplifying things. A woman raising a child alone faces too many challenges. Annie, that's your lifelong happiness." In the end, she didn't heed her mother's advice. Rebellion was a trait she had nurtured since childhood. Her mother took early retirement and came to the city to be with Annie. In the first few days of her mother's arrival, Annie's single apartment was filled with a somber atmosphere, her mother's eyes slightly red but words unspoken. On the contrary, Annie showed no signs of pregnancy, eating and sleeping well, continuing to take on tasks and attend events. Later, Annie's parents accepted the situation, gradually adapting to their roles as grandparents. However, Annie started experiencing insomnia, questioning if she was being too selfish. She decided to find the man from that night. Seeking help from a friend in the police department, she obtained a certificate and went to the hotel to identify the man from that night. However, she cursed herself for forgetting the room number, only recalling the floor. The hotel staff seemed hesitant. "Sorry, our surveillance footage is regularly cleared. As for guest registration, we can only retrieve information on all guests if there's an extremely special reason." After numerous difficulties, she found 2 people who were somewhat similar, but upon seeing their photos, she knew neither was the one. Sitting dejectedly in a chair, her friend analyzed that the hotel reservation might have been made by someone else for the man, making it challenging to trace. "Why insist on keeping him? Aren't you afraid he'll burden you? But if I abort him, I'll carry the guilt for the rest of my life. You don't understand, even though he's not fully formed yet, I've already felt that intimate connection between a mother and her child." The child was born smoothly, a beautiful girl with especially captivating eyes, reminiscent of the eyes of that unfamiliar man. Annie named her Emily. After 100 days, Annie joined the Single Moms Club to exchange and learn about parenting. Joining the club, she discovered that there were many single mothers in society. However, most willingly became mothers due to love, knowing who the child's father was, only to be abandoned. It seemed there were not many like Annie, who decided to keep the child conceived from a one-night stand. "You're really brave," they said to her. Annie found the tone strange, a mix of admiration and mockery. The atmosphere in the club wasn't as positive as Annie had imagined. It was filled with complaints and unrest, with many desperately trying to find a father figure for their children. They told Annie, even with help, it's still like a nightmare. Being a woman raising a child is too difficult, too lonely. Annie retorted, "I admit that being a single mom requires more sacrifices than being a single woman, but single moms can experience the happiness of being a mother." Happiness? Imagine this, your whole life revolves around the child. Changing diapers, feeding, dressing, putting them to sleep, it's all on you. Playing with them, explaining things they don't understand, tolerating their tantrums. If they get sick, it's a mental and physical torment. It's overwhelming. They continued to chatter, and Annie gained little experience but absorbed a lot of negativity. There were indeed many aspects Annie hadn't considered, like the complexities of household registration, which proved much more challenging than she had imagined. In the blink of an eye, 3 years had passed. Due to her child, Annie gradually shifted her focus to behind-the-scenes work, establishing a transcription studio where she no longer personally took on tasks. While many saw their careers take a step back after having children, Annie never gave herself an excuse to rest and relax. Throughout these 3 years, her parents stood as her strong support, making everything that seemed difficult and overwhelming appear less challenging. During this time, she actively went on blind dates, but none seemed suitable. Many advised her to settle for someone who would be good to her child, not being too picky. However, Annie didn't see it that way. She was looking for a partner for herself, not just a father for her child. Yet, as she conversed with one man after another, she gradually understood the words her mother spoke years ago during a phone call. Women who have had children seem to be devalued to an extent she hadn't realized before. Annie thought she would always prioritize her career and dreams, scoffing at marriage and family. Suddenly, nearing her 30s, she discovered how much she yearned for a fulfilling family life. She didn't know when her mindset had changed. In the past, she prided herself on disliking stability and monotony. Now, as her career flourished, she found herself enviously admiring the idea of a marriage where she could spend the years together. Especially when the thought of growing old alone terrified her. Annie was honest, she wasn't as happy now. She wanted to be someone's girlfriend or wife, she needed a man. Her life might not be perfect, but she was now crazily longing for completeness. When a 20-year-old intern in the studio earnestly told her that single moms could also have their own brilliance, Annie shook her head repeatedly. Annie, times are changing, marriage isn't the only choice for women. Everything is moving towards freedom and development. I've considered not getting married. Annie didn't argue, she just listened quietly, watching her as if seeing her younger self. Life always takes a few years to fully comprehend. Anyway, as a woman about to turn 30, she crazily wanted to get married. Even if the marriage wasn't happy, she wanted to jump into the pit of marriage. Having something was better than having nothing. After the negotiation, Annie shook hands with the man across the table. When he asked her what she was going to do next, she didn't hide anything and straightforwardly mentioned that she had to pick up her child. The man looked surprised. You already have a child? Annie casually smiled, young and naive. Annie hadn't driven there, and the man, named Gary, suggested that he could give her a ride. Quick to react, she graciously agreed, sure. Gary, at the age of 34, worked in the field of online broadcasting and was Annie's new business partner. Like many successful men, Gary was mature and stable. Annie liked this type of man, but she assumed that such an outstanding man wouldn't be interested in her. It was a fact, a challenge, and an expected truth of life. So, Annie didn't have any special thoughts about Gary. However, they did become more acquainted during their work negotiations. Gary was quite open with Annie, admitting that he had been divorced once. Annie's hand, pouring tea, paused for a moment, and she asked in an extremely plain tone, why? Because I strayed during the marriage. She had OCD and insisted on divorcing me. Annie's hand instinctively wanted to call him a scumbag, but considering that Gary was her business partner, she held back. She had encountered quite a few scumbags herself. Thinking about it, she decided to keep her thoughts to herself. Like many versions of the story, men often couldn't accept the young and lively girl they married, only to have her transform into a complaining and nagging woman over the years. We were together for 10 years, and she changed too much. She wasn't the person I used to love. So, I had that immoral one-night stand, but that night truly liberated me freely and genuinely. We've been divorced for 4 years now, and she's doing well in her single life. Now, we've become good friends, but we can never go back. Annie just listened quietly without making any comments. Such matters were difficult for outsiders to judge. In today's society, infidelity was still considered unforgivable, and people wished ill upon unfaithful partners. However, the truth was that love would inevitably become dull one day. When both parties couldn't maintain the freshness of love, one might resort to an affair to release their true nature and regain vitality. Annie only said that she could understand, but she didn't approve. In her view of marriage, she felt that she would like to be with one person for a lifetime, sharing household chores, quarreling, making up, and growing old together. Day after day, love would become a habit rather than a general sense of dullness. What about you? Don't you consider finding a father for your child? Gary, noticing that Annie hadn't commented on his situation, quietly shifted the conversation back to her. I am actively looking for a partner for myself. Because, let's face it, which man would willingly love a child with no blood relation? So, I just hope that he can love both of us, and that would be good enough, Annie replied. Gary felt that when Annie spoke these words, she exuded a charming light. It was the first time he had heard such a decisive answer. He wanted to use the word intelligent to describe her, as she seemed to see through many things with clarity. Without beating around the bush, Gary lifted his teacup, took a small sip, and then looked directly at Annie, asking, "Do you think we are a good match?" "But I don't agree with your views on marriage," Annie responded. Gary chuckled lightly. "Don't you think I'm honest? I'm just stating the thoughts of most men, and in the future, I'll definitely be afraid of the consequences of infidelity." "Didn't you stay with the woman who allowed you to liberate your true self?" "How could that be? I don't love her. It's easy to like someone, but falling in love with someone is not that simple. So far, I've only loved my ex-wife, and I didn't want to divorce her, you know. Annie blinked slowly, paused for a moment, and then asked Gary, "What about your feelings for me?" "To what extent?" "Appreciation." During the long period after returning home, Annie's heart kept pounding, and she even told Emily the bedtime story incorrectly. "Mom, what is Gary? Shouldn't princesses be with princes?" Emily asked. Annie's face slightly warmed. "Yes, the princess is with the prince. Mommy made a mistake." Emily fell asleep cuddling her teddy bear, but Annie, leaning by Emily's bedside, had no sleepiness at all. She had known Gary for several months, but such explicit conversation was a first. She hadn't expected Gary to have those kinds of intentions towards her. A woman, no matter how old, when encountering a man who stirs her heart, will unquestionably revert to a teenage mindset. Tonight, when Gary drove her back, she unexpectedly felt that romantic sensation. Was it because she was too lonely? She struggled for a long time and then sent Gary a text, "The day after tomorrow, there's a parent-child activity at the kindergarten. Are you available?" Gary replied instantly, "Yes." One word, straightforward. The next day, Annie received a package containing 2 sets of sportswear, one for Emily and one for her. It was from that expensive sports brand. This was the first gift Gary had given her, and this set of affectionate parent-child outfits found its way into Annie's heart. To Annie's surprise, when Gary came to pick them up for the kindergarten activity, he was also dressed in a matching set. Annie's face lit up with genuine delight at Gary's outfit. She thought, "He's truly a thoughtful man." In sportswear, Gary looked younger. Holding Emily, he gave Annie the illusion of a complete family. However, Emily's eyes were nothing like Gary's. For years had passed, and Annie couldn't recall the details the stranger had brought into her life, his breath, his warmth. Only when she saw Emily's eyes did she vaguely remember the attractive eyes of that man. When he closed his eyes, his eyelashes were so long and dense. At some point, Annie had given up the search. When you're searching for one person, you gain a deeper understanding of the vastness of your homeland. With no leads, finding him seemed like a fairy tale. That day, Emily was exceptionally happy. Annie suddenly understood the feelings of single mothers looking for a father for their children. Sometimes, a child's happiness is more important than one's own. Annie sighed inwardly, feeling that she had become too frightening now. Emily matured early. Even though they tried to hide things from Emily, she could vaguely sense something. Especially after Emily started kindergarten, she would ask questions about her father, but now she no longer asked. Emily's silence on this matter made Annie particularly distressed. It was her mistake, but her child bore the burden. Through Emily's reactions, Annie finally mustered the courage to call Gary and say, "Gary, about what you mentioned before, I will seriously consider it." After the call, Annie felt an inexplicable sense of surreal beauty surrounding her. Even the air she breathed seemed unexpectedly fresh. So, when her assistant called, saying there was a meeting and they were short-handed, Annie answered without much thought, "I have time." However, making decisions when your head is hot and dizzy is not the best idea. When Annie arrived at the venue, she realized she knew nothing about the field she was supposed to transcribe. Various formulas and symbols were completely unfamiliar to her. She took out her recording pen, thinking that she would have to spend the remaining time researching and organizing. Annie had been in the transcription business for 10 years, and she had more experience than anyone else. But there were always aspects of knowledge that she had never encountered. Transcribing a 3-hour meeting was challenging for Annie. Unexpectedly, as soon as the meeting ended, they asked Annie for the meeting records. She mumbled that she needed to organize them further. "It's okay, we can handle the organization," they said. "Well," just as Annie didn't know how to respond, a male voice suddenly interjected, "What's wrong? Where are the meeting records?" Annie followed the source of the voice and, turning around, found herself frozen in place. She thought she couldn't remember his eyes, but unexpectedly, she remembered everything about him so clearly. Chris also recognized Annie immediately, but neither of them revealed their feelings. Following Chris to the office, Annie transferred the meeting records to Chris's computer. "Being honest," Annie said, "because I didn't do my homework beforehand, I couldn't record many professional terms. I recorded the audio instead." Chris glanced at Annie indifferently, didn't say anything, just browsed the files on the computer. Only at the bottom did he casually say something unrelated, "So, you're a transcriptionist." As soon as Chris finished speaking, Annie's heart pounded. He admitted that he knew her. But before Annie could say anything, Chris continued, "Not many mistakes. They urgently needed above. Stay here and help me review it. They were very close, both staring at the computer screen, their faces almost touching. Annie pretended to be calm, but her breath was already chaotic. At that moment, the office door suddenly opened, and high heels made a crisp sound on the floor. Annie looked up, and a young girl's face came into view, but her behavior was more like a shrew. Chris. She circled around the desk, pulled Annie away, and was about to slap Chris. Chris grabbed her hand and said with some anger, "What are you doing?" "I'm working." "What kind of work requires faces to be so close? Can't you see? We're editing documents." Chris was annoyed by her unreasonable disturbance, and his words were not friendly. So Annie witnessed a free drama unfold, with the woman shouting that she wanted to break up with Chris. Surprisingly, Chris didn't try to stop her at all, and he didn't continue to chase her even when she ran out. "Let's continue," Chris said to Annie. "Is she okay?" Chris smiled and shook his head, saying something ambiguous. "Being with someone you don't love is quite torturous." Annie wanted to ask more, but Chris had already immersed himself in his work. More than half an hour later, the document was completed, and Chris called his assistant to bring it to the boss. Annie closed her machine, and Chris waited until she finished a series of actions before speaking. "There are a few more sessions tonight. Will you continue recording?" Annie smiled. "No, the work has been arranged. I came in temporarily, and if I stay, I might cause trouble." Annie thought Chris would continue the previous topic, but unexpectedly, he suddenly asked, "Are you married?" He casually glanced at Annie's smooth fingers. Fortunately, Annie reacted quickly. She replied succinctly, "No," and then asked, "What about you?" Chris shook his head, "But my family is urging me. They're getting old and want a grandchild." Annie felt a twinge in her heart, silently thinking, "I've already given them a granddaughter." But everything was still uncertain, and she wouldn't say anything. "Well," Annie hadn't finished her sentence when her phone rang. It was about the evening work. Someone who was supposed to come couldn't make it, so they asked Annie to substitute. Chris listened to the conversation vaguely, looking surprised. "Your name is Annie? Is Annie Studio yours?" Annie nodded without denying it. Suddenly, she had the idea of staying and working in the evening. Before meeting Chris, Annie thought Gary was the person she most wanted, but now she suddenly felt that her liking for Gary was only because she thought he was suitable. However, her feelings for Chris were just that, feelings, unrelated to any external conditions. Like the first time she saw him, an affectionate feeling arose without any reservations. Annie asked Chris for some professional books, but Chris honestly admitted that he had nothing to do at the moment and could teach her. Chris's language expression and logical thinking were both strong. With Chris's explanation, Annie gained a general understanding of their industry. However, Annie always felt a subtle emotional atmosphere in the office. Was it because she unconsciously thought more when she heard his voice and felt his presence? He was indeed a good-looking man, and Annie realized that she might be infatuated with his appearance. She suddenly remembered a story where the parents of the male protagonist gave a large sum of money to the female lead, but she tore the plane ticket and solemnly said to his parents, "I am infatuated with his beauty." "Why are you smiling?" Chris's voice came, and Annie realized that she had drifted off. Apologetically, she smiled and said, "Nothing, I didn't expect you to still look so young after 4 years. How old are you?" "Exactly 30. And you?" "Me too, October birthday." "June," Chris replied. Annie silently calculated, he was exactly 4 months older than her. So, the two of them, like newly acquainted friends, started chatting from the most basic topics. Despite Annie having had numerous negotiations, none of them were as cautious as this one, fearing to say something wrong. "I tried to find you later, but there was no gain," Chris said with a hint of regret in his tone. Annie was surprised. "Find me for what?" "I'm not a casual guy, I rarely play these games, the risks are too high." "So you mean I'm a casual woman?" Annie said playfully, causing Chris to burst into laughter. After finishing work that night, Annie sent a message to Gary, "I met Emily's biological father." As soon as the message was sent, Gary called. Annie didn't hide anything and shared the details with Gary. "Do you know his intentions?" Gary asked. "I don't know for sure yet, but some of his words make me wonder," Annie replied honestly. Gary graciously wished her good luck. After hanging up the phone, Annie lay in bed but couldn't fall asleep. The night was cool, and the encounter with Chris made her more aware of his warmth. Seeing him today brought back some memories, still vivid. He mentioned that he had also searched for her. If they had found each other earlier, would everything be different now? Annie couldn't fully comprehend it, but she had a vague sense that their reunion was a stroke of luck, and she was determined to seize the opportunity. In the following week, Annie got caught up in a busy schedule, and she couldn't find a suitable excuse to meet Chris, so she kept delaying. It wasn't until Friday night when Annie went to pick up Emily from the kindergarten. On the way, her assistant asked for some documents, and Annie remembered they were locked in her drawer. "Wait a moment, I'll go to the office and get them for you." After picking up Emily, Annie drove to the studio. She had never brought Emily to her workplace, as there weren't many people who knew she had a child. As Annie walked into the office, holding Emily's hand, she collided with Chris, who was waiting for her. "Mr. Chris said there's something he needs." The assistant's words trailed off as she sensed the unusual atmosphere, looking at the three of them. Annie and Emily, dressed in matching light pink mother-daughter outfits, stood together, creating a harmonious scene. Chris couldn't take his eyes off Emily, and Annie nervously watched Chris. The assistant cleared her throat. "Well, I'll leave you to it." In the quiet office, Chris gazed at Emily, feeling a different kind of emotion. It was Emily who broke the silence, unaware of what had transpired. She said in her sweet voice, "Mommy, I'm thirsty, want water?" "Oh, sure, Mommy will get it for you." "Annie, do you want to explain?" In the revolving restaurant of the city's tallest building, Chris and Annie sat across from each other. The exquisite food was neatly arranged on small plates, but neither of them had the appetite to pick up their chopsticks. Annie didn't want to continue hiding from him, just as you suspected. "You. How can you, as a woman, not consider the consequences of your actions?" "I don't consider? Did you consider that night?" Chris was momentarily silenced by Annie's words, sighing helplessly. Chris looked at the woman in front of him, contemplating from the initial amazement and joy when they first met to the current admiration and appreciation. Despite 4 years passing, she still seemed to be the person he liked. At the age of 26, Chris, like many others, had already lost faith in love. However, that night, he acted as if possessed, making him almost believe in love for a considerable period. If he had known that his impulsive actions would bring such significant changes to a woman, he would never have made that choice. He didn't know what Annie had been through in these years, but the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't met Annie frightened him. He almost became an irresponsible husband and father. In a short period, Chris's mind raced, thinking about many things. However, when it came to speaking, all he could say was, "Annie, you're a woman who makes me love and hate at the same time." Annie raised an eyebrow, finally having the appetite to taste the visually appealing food. However, before Annie's fork touched the food, Chris continued, "Let's get the marriage license tomorrow." Annie put down her fork, though her heart was pounding. She still maintained a half-smiling expression and said, "I didn't say I want to marry you." "If you don't marry me, who will you marry? Do I look like someone who can't get married? You better clean up your messy relationships first." Clearly, Annie still harbored some resentment towards the woman who suddenly appeared in the office that day. "I don't have messy relationships. You're the only one, the first woman I treated with my heart, not just my mind." In the end, Annie didn't agree to get the marriage license with Chris the next day, but she couldn't deny that Chris's attitude did bring her a sense of reassurance. However, everything happened so quickly that she wasn't mentally prepared. The marriage that she had been thinking about became less important after meeting Chris. She thought she had become conventional, wanting a marriage like most people, but looking at Chris, she suddenly realized that what she wanted most was love, a love that made her feel fortunate. In the days that followed, Chris and Annie defied convention. They had a child first, then fell in love, and later got married. However, these steps often caused discontent in Emily. "Mom, why are you going on a date again?" "Because Mom wants to date Dad." "Mom, I want to date Dad too." As Annie spent more time with Chris, she discovered Chris's childish side, and Chris realized that Annie wasn't the strong and independent woman she appeared to be. She was, in fact, a gentle and delicate woman. "When should we change Emily's last name to match mine?" "No. Our daughter will have my last name." "All right, then when are you going to give me another son?" "Get lost." Annie has never complained about her fate. She has consistently strived for progress, perhaps making her deserving of favor. However, in the end, not everyone can possess true love, and not everyone will experience such fortune. But by listening to these beautiful stories around us, can we regain courage and confidence?